Go to Discord. All right. Welcome back again. If you're new here to our FMSN events, welcome. If you are not new, we are happy to have you back. As I mentioned earlier, I am Mila Frank and I'm events manager for FMSN. This is a place where foreign-born military spouses can connect, feel understood, and get support as they navigate this unique lifestyle. One of the hardest part of this journey is to adjusting to this new culture. Even if you have lived in the United States, it still feel confusing, lonely, and just off. It's just the way people communicate, socialize, and even go to do shopping or looking for a job. It's completely different and it's not always easy to understand. And unfortunately, we don't have a handbook how to manage all these changes. This is why you can view our mission and vision as a FMSN. We are here to help and to change on things and help you to adjust and figure it out, not by yourself. Also, this is why we are so grateful to have Dr. Battle with us tonight. She is an expert in life transitions and cultural adaptation, and she brings both professional knowledge and deep compassion to this work. So, Dr. Battle, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and I will be sharing your slides now if we can start. 1 second. All right.
Hey,
Let's see. This is slides.
but let's see, it hasn't come up yet, but while we're waiting for them to get started, I just want to open with saying how honored I am today to be with you guys. And in my current life, I am a trauma recovery coach as well as a cultural adaptation and identity, what I'm beginning to call identity reinvention coach. But before that, I spent a career in the Air Force as an Air Force logistics officer. And I was a military spouse, so we were a dual military spouse couple, raising our children in the military lifestyle, both domestically and overseas. And like many families, we lived through PCS moves and deployments and lots of PDYs. And so I've had the lived experience of what you guys are going through, not from the capacity of being a foreign-born spouse, but having lived within the military lifestyle. So I bring some of that lived experience to the table, as well as my professional training and knowledge and the work that I've done within the community. But what I will cover later today is ways in which I believe some of my own background gives me some appreciation, understanding for what the members of this organization are going through as foreign-born spouses, both because I am a mother-in-law to a foreign-born spouse, and I'll share a little bit about some of our dance that we've done in terms of our relationship and our capacity, especially around adaptations around cultural nuances and differences, as well as having lived overseas and been that outsider in an overseas environment. And so hopefully some of those lived experiences I will be able to bring to a table in a way that you guys will find helpful and useful from today's session. So let's see. I'm going to try to see if I can advance the slide, and if I can't, then Mila, I will look to you to help. It's not letting me do so. Next slide.
All right.
All right. So first, as I've already done, I would like to welcome you guys, and hopefully at the end of the session, you'll feel like this space has been created for you and that you will walk away with some information that you find useful and helpful. So you're not alone. That's the biggest piece. If you don't walk away with anything else from the time we spend together today, is that this is a journey that matters and that you are not alone in this space. And we'll talk about how we can close some of the gaps for anyone that's experiencing that feeling alone in an unfamiliar environment and culture. Culture, identity, change are deeply personal. We'll get into that a little bit today. Each of us has different experiences. There are a lot of overlaps and a lot of commonalities between our experiences with respect to being in a new environment and feeling like an outsider. Yet at the same time, depending upon our circumstances, our backgrounds, our home cultures, our environment, how we adapt within this environment also brings the personal to it. So today is about understanding. It's not about how well we think we're doing or we're not doing, because we're all here to learn. And one thing that I know and I have learned over the years is that it really is a journey, and there are going to be missteps along the way, but also lots of joys, lots of great experiences, and that we learn how to navigate between those spaces as we move along. And so it's not about having the answers, it's about naming the experience. I'm a firm believer in that. I do know that when I began to get language around the experiences I was having, it also gave me a space and a place to begin to understand what was happening to me and why I'm feeling that way. And in the work that I've done for well over 20 years now, and especially with military families, the one thing I've learned, and especially with the kids, is they're navigating this space at the same time that we're navigating this space, and they're going through their cultural adaptations and changes right alongside us. But what I really learned with the kids when I would do training for, especially the adolescents, when they would be given a language for what they're feeling that normalized how they're feeling, then that naming experience really would help them to begin to make sense of everything that was going on and happening with them in terms of their own adjustment. So whether you are new to this, and I'm going to have a question in a quick moment. People, I'll try to put my screen where I can see everyone that's on the call. Hold on. Got it. Just like a quick show of hands, how many people are new to this experience and how many have been doing this for a while? How about people new to this experience? So you guys said, okay, how about you've been doing it for less than a year? Less than 2 years? 3? 4 years? 10? All right. Okay. So, but by virtue of the fact that you guys are here, is you're recognizing that even after 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 years of being in this lifestyle, being military selected, through our spouses, that this lifestyle will continue to present challenges and changes. I'll touch on that a little bit in a further slide. So today, the session is not about getting everything right, but it's about naming what very often goes unnamed. We'll talk about the invisible layer of cultural adaptation, as well as the courage that it takes for us to build and rebuild and change, and in some cases, reinvent our identity as our identity shifts along the way, being in this lifestyle. And since most of you have been it for a while, would you agree that you have experienced shifts in your identity and how you see the world and what your worldview is over that time? Absolutely. Absolutely. So just take a deep breath, and we're here, and let's begin the journey together in terms of talking about what it means for cultural adaptation and adjustment to the American culture and the military lifestyle, because they do go together very much. Next slide. Okay. I'm not going to go into this. Mila summarized it pretty succinctly, so thank you for that. But that's just a little bit about who I am. As I shared, I'm a retired Air Force officer. I'm a retired, well, not an Air Force officer, but a former military spouse. I've raised 4 children in the military lifestyle. I am now the mother-in-law of a foreign spouse. I'm the grandmother of a military kid. So I'm watching that intergenerational piece that's happening now. And I'm loving with my granddaughter because I see so many of the things that I've learned professionally over the years that I did not have in my Wilhelm when I was raising my children in the military. when I first started working with military families, I remember this couple asked me, but your children are all grown and gone. So why on earth are you working with military families if you don't have your kids at home anymore? And I said, oh my goodness, I'm doing this because I wish there had been people there for me when I was navigating this lifestyle. I probably would have done some things very differently had I known. So I do it from a place of passion, a place of heart. Next slide. How many people are familiar with the term third culture kid? All righty.
I used to be an educator, so I taught international schools, and
Okay.
yeah, bit of the town.
So you're familiar with the work of Ruth Van Rieten?
Sorry?
Around. You got any?
Ruth Van Rieten? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I
Ruth and
read
I
it,
are,
yeah.
are colleagues and good friends, and so I highly recommend that book. She's got a new edition that hopefully will be coming out by spring. And I've gotten to see some of the updates, and so I'm really excited about what's going to be coming. So my intention for today is to help normalize the emotional and cultural responses to living a highly mobile transitional lifestyle, offer a few practical tools for adjustment, reflect, and hopefully during the Q&A portion of this call, we'll be able to do some reflections and discussion around shared cultural experiences, and to encourage, and if you've read Ruth's book, and if you haven't read Ruth's book, I highly, highly encourage her, plus some other really great books that are out there around the idea of resilience, voice, and belonging. Those are critical to being able to successfully navigate the history. And for, is it Selena, with that, you that showed me, that said you were an educator in international schools?
Yeah, I was.
And I'm sure you know how much resilience with the kids you talked about, although I always caution, kids are very, very resilient, but just like a rubber band, if you stretch it too much, it will pop. And so, but part of what helps us to be able to navigate and get through this successfully is because we develop a lot of resilience along the way, and we learn how to have voice and work towards figuring out ways to feel more like I belong in the environment that I'm in. And very often I've worked with people who have felt like the outsider for their entire time in this work. And so it becomes really important that we begin to figure out what does belonging look like for us, and what does it feel like, and what does it mean. Next slide. All right. How many people are aware of the 4 stages of culture shock? By now, most of you, based upon having been in this field for a while, raise your hands, okay, all right. So I'm just going to go over it very quickly. The 4 stages of culture shock, or honeymoon, is when we first get to a new environment and everything is new and we're excited. And we haven't really dug in or had the experiences that end up sometimes throwing us for a loop. That happen. We're still almost in like that tour stage when we get there, so we might be trying to move, we're busy trying to get settled in, trying to home, get the kids in school, everything. So we're in that honeymoon phase. And then invariably frustration sets in. Not for everyone, but for a lot of us. I can recall my frustration during moves. The furniture didn't arrive on time. The kids were having difficulty getting into the curriculum that they needed because of being frequent movers. My kids were struggling because every time we moved to a new state, they were being required to take state history or state geography again in lieu of something that they really needed to graduate on time. So those kinds of things have become really frustrating for us. And then the next stage, adjustment. And then finally, hopefully, we can agree. But I also want to point out that this is not necessarily a linear process. This is just a really good way to lay out that there are stages of culture shock, and that most of us will go through all the stages. But we can also move between stages. We can skip stages. depending upon the situation. we can go from, we're getting ready to go into integration. I remember my first assignment, I got to my assignment, I was told I would be there for 4 years. And so I finally started adapting and adjusting, and my daughter was adapting and adjusting. And 9 months into my assignment, they said, "You're moving," right? So I didn't get to integration in that first assignment because I had to go all the way back to the beginning because I had a new assignment 9 months later. So does that make sense? That it's presented as linear, but it's not necessarily linear, and not everyone will necessarily go through all of these stages depending upon the personal as well as the environment and situation that you find yourself in.
And
Next slide.
sometimes by the time you are like at this and you're like, oh, I'm getting integrated, then they move you. Then they don't care. Then they move you and you gotta start all over again.
Exactly. You got to start
Yeah.
all over again. And so that's part
Yeah.
of why I wanted to point out that this is in ideal circumstances, in an ideal world. And
Yes.
when all the concepts about culture shock were really coming in, I don't really think they had international movers in mind with this
Yeah.
concept, right? This concept
Yes.
evolved and got adapted to help people who are frequent movers, high movers, or international movers begin to make sense of the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to age myself. I promise you, when I first went into the military, I didn't have any of this background. I wasn't a coach. I wasn't a therapist. You know, it was an entirely new environment for me with no preparation, no training, no awareness. So it was learn on the job and counting on my peers and my colleagues and my friends to help me figure things out along the way. So I'm really glad to see how much we've evolved, and of course, we still have a lot of work to do. Next slide. All right. Now, I'm going to put this up here. How many people have seen the cultural iceberg? I know I'm looking at Sahana saying she's probably familiar with it, but everybody's familiar with the cultural iceberg? Okay, not everybody. So I'm just going to quickly go through it. But I love the cultural iceberg because very often I think this is where the missteps take place. Now, I'm trying to avoid saying mistakes because I don't believe they're mistakes. I think all mistakes are learning opportunities for us. When we have missteps and we have faux pas, it's also an excellent opportunity for us to learn. We may have to sit in it for a while before we can move to that next stage, but that's generally how I see it. So I'm going to use me and my daughter-in-law as an example. And the reason I say that is because we were stationed in the Philippines for 5 years. My daughter-in-law is a foreign-born spouse from the Philippines. So when we first became family, I really believed, because I spent 5 years in the Philippines, I was going to get it about her, right? I think on some level because she was aware. My son was born in the Philippines. Her husband was born in the Philippines. So I think on some level she was kind of assuming the same way that I was, that we would just automatically kind of get it about each other. So in the cultural iceberg, which was developed by Everett T. Hall, he did this model in 1976. And what he observed and developed a model around was that very often we interact, whether it's within culture or between and amongst cultures, that we actually interact at the surface level. So we begin to say, well, we're going to try out food from other cultures. Our culture itself on the surface, we think in terms of flags for our country, the festivals that we have, the clothes we wear, all those things that are outward, that's what I call it, outward markers of culture. So the dances, the games, the artwork, the artistry, the literature, our language, right? Our commonality when we're within culture, right? The monocultural experience, I should say. So all those are all the things that are above the surface that we can see with our eyes. We can see the differences in the food. We can see the differences in the dances, the music, performances. So all of that is up at the surface level. Because I lived in the Philippines, I recognized that my awareness of that culture did go somewhat beneath the surface, beneath the water, in the unseen, because I had lived in some of that unseen. So I learned things like facial expressions and gestures and how eye contact was done, personal space. I know when we were prepping for the talk today, we had this really fun conversation about personal space and eye contact and touching, whether it's a high touch culture or a low touch culture kind of thing. So a lot of this, in terms of like communication and some of the more surface rules at the higher level of the beneath the surface rules, I was aware of because of having lived and spent time in the culture, made mistakes, said wrong things, did wrong things that I wasn't aware of in the deeper culture. But then when we got into the even deeper culture, that's where I started recognizing, well, wait, I was stationed in one part of the Philippines. She was from a different part of the Philippines whose culture was slightly different than the culture where I was. Plus, let's add the military cultural layer over where I was stationed. Right? And so for a lot of the people in the local community that I interacted with, I realized later that very often they were adapting their interactions with me because they were accustomed to dealing with Americans, working and living in that environment. So there were things that I thought I knew and understood that I didn't. Does that make sense? Now, for my daughter-in-law and I, we ended up, like a lot of times when we're interacting with families and new cultures, we did our dance, we did our missteps, we did our miscommunications around things that I made assumptions, she made assumptions, but then thankfully we began to start recognizing there's not this right or wrong, there's this different. And how do we navigate our relationship? How do we come together as, I consider her very much my daughter, as mother-daughter, right? In terms of the nuances, and me allowing myself to become more curious about her experiences, her culture, right? And asking her more questions and asking her, how is it done in your culture? Right? One of the first conversations was making pasta. And her way of making pasta was not at all the way that I learned to make pasta. So I just started running to say, well, how do you do it where you were from? So that's part of the journey. Next slide. Is this helpful to look at this slide? The colorful iceberg? Yeah. I just love the colorful iceberg because so often we really are interacting with other people from different cultures at the very surface level and missing all of the nuances that exist underneath. And sometimes we just flat out run into them. Right? We have the crash. So I'm going to jump a little bit into military life. I mentioned that, even though I spent time in the Philippines and my daughter-in-law returned to the Philippines, recognizing at some point that I had the military life overlaid over that local environment that I was in. And they get a lot of forgiveness of the mistakes that we made because they recognize that, right? So what makes military life unique? You guys have been doing it for a while. I don't need to tell you, but these are things that can add to the complexity of this experience. The frequent relocations, like Sonia said earlier, just about the time you think you're getting ready to integrate into the culture that you're in, the order settled, right? And then we're packing up and we're moving again. And some of us are doing overseas assignments, and now we're going to get another different culture. Some of us are making those moves to the U.S. for the first time, and we're encountering culture shock and trying to learn how to navigate that, and especially when we first arrive in a new assignment, because we're also about the business of getting ourselves settled into our new location. So military has unique social customs and expectations. And I have to tell you, I was an American citizen, but when I first went to training in the military, one of the biggest adjustments I had was trying to learn all of the acronyms, learn the customs, learn the courtesies. That was going to be a part of my life for many years to come. The language differences, the expressions, the words, the structure of language, all of those kinds of things make this life unique. And I'm sure if you talk to people who are in the diplomatic corps, they will say the same thing to you. I have had conversations with people who are in the foreign service, and because we have those commonalities of frequent relocations and the moving around and encountering and adapting to different environments, but at some point, the military or the foreign service specific language can get in the way. Does that make sense? So at one point, we're speaking the same language, and all of a sudden, we realize we don't understand each other. because we're in two totally different cultural environments. Next slide. If anybody has any questions about the slides themselves or what's on it, don't hesitate to ask me or pop a note in the chat box for me. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and so if we want to get into more detailed discussions, then that's where we'll do the detailed discussions in the Q&A portion of the presentation. Next slide. Working in America, language, cultures, and expectations. And I kind of touched on a little bit in the last slide. Cultural norms in the workplace can be very different. So as we move around in the assignments, and especially for the spouses, because they're looking for jobs in the local community, in some ways, when I was active duty, it was easier for me because I could count on the military positions. The culture was the same, even though I was moving into new jobs and new locations. With respect to the culture of the military, there was a constant for me. There wasn't a constant for my children, right? There was a constant for me because we were a dual military couple. So very often I didn't have to explain what I was doing to my spouse because we had the same boss, right? So in some of those ways, even though I was a military spouse, expected to do and act and behave as the military tends to expect spouses to act, in some ways, I know it was much easier for me because there were lots of other things that remained constant for me and my spouse. Not so much for our children. I'll put that out there right now. So a gesture in one culture may be confusing or appropriate in another. Anybody encounter those? When I first got to the Philippines, I was not aware that sitting with my legs crossed with my foot pointing to the ceiling meant I was showing them the shoot. So, and I was insulting without even realizing it. And thank goodness, I had a male assistant at the time, an older gentleman, probably in his 60s, who was kind enough to pull me to the side and share with me that people are really upset with you right now because that gesture is a no-no in the Philippines. Thank you for letting me know. All right. So sometimes a gesture in one culture can be confusing or inappropriate in others. And every time we move, we're probably going to encounter that. And it doesn't matter whether we're moving from one domestic state in the U.S. to another domestic state in the U.S. or we're traveling between cultures and amongst cultures globally. I've done them in all. When in doubt, ask, observe, and adjust without judging yourself. Recognize, I'm new to this. I am new to this. And very often, one of the challenges that does come is if I am from a different culture and I move to a culture where I look like the people in that culture. So if I am Hispanic or Latino and I move to a Latin-based culture, it may be a very different Latin-based culture than the one that I'm from, but people may not immediately recognize this is not my home culture. And they will have this expectation that you should know that. My maiden name is Martinez. I used to get accosted by little old ladies because I didn't speak Spanish and I didn't know the culture, right? They were not very forgiving of me at all because that was an important part of the culture to them and this expectation that it should be an important part of the culture for you. Mistakes don't define us. Missteps don't define us. They teach us. Right? And to remember, whatever culture you find yourself in, with movement, you belong. And our job is to begin to learn and adapt and find ways to cope and respond and participate in those cultures, sometimes easier than others. Any thoughts, comments there?
It's funny that you mentioned about even work settings. What happened to you in Philippines? Your wrong body language. Actually, it wasn't wrong for you, but it was offensive for them. It's kind of the same as happened to me when I started to work in American work position. Some jokes I used to do, say in Italy, which completely normal in Italian culture, in America they may sound offensive. And I'm lucky now because I have my supervisor who like, Mila, as it's better if you don't say this anymore because it might sound offensive. But not everybody has this person that can direct them and say like, hey, this is offensive. So you can keep doing it and you can ruin also relationship.
Yep, it is so helpful when we have cultural ambassadors within our workspaces to help guide us and not be afraid because they recognize we don't necessarily know the rules, right? And if we don't know the rules, we are going to do cultural faux pas. But it really does help when we have ambassadors that recognize that and they're willing to come and share with us. That's kind of not acceptable in this culture, even though it may be acceptable in my culture, in my home culture.
One thing that
Next slide.
blows was
No,
when I
sorry, go
was
ahead.
working in Myanmar. So I was working in Myanmar, Burma, and one thing that still blows my mind was during like the cultural orientation at school, we were told not to make like ostentatious requests from like the Burmese people because they don't have a word to say no to you, like in their language. So they don't have like small talk or they don't have like a word to say no to you. So if you ask them for something, they'll do it. And they're extremely nice. Like, so if you ask them like, oh, where can I find this repair shop? They will take your vehicle and like go repair it. So you have to be like, they're very, very nice and very down to earth. And if you ask them and if they don't do something and if they just say, okay, okay, that means you have to understand that that's them saying, I cannot do this for you. So
I
that
cannot do
that, that blows my mind.
Yeah. I lived in China. It was a little similar in China. And what I began to learn is because of the face saving, a lot of times they would nod and like it's an agreement, but in reality, it, it wasn't okay. So I had to kind of start learning, like you said, if they're saying okay, what does okay really mean in their culture when they're responding to? So absolutely. And there in China, I was really fortunate because I had some of my coworkers that were more than willing to help me navigate the cultural nuances of their culture. I made less mistakes, but made less mistakes. Next slide. Cultural clashes and layers. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I suspect everybody can relate at least to one or more of the items that's in here. In terms of layers, we're going back to cultural icebergs, the things that are beneath the surface that will get us into trouble, that will result in cultural clashes or us navigating the different layers of culture, both at the surface, below the surface, and then in the deep culture. So whether it's direct communication versus indirect communication. So Hannah, I think you were describing indirect communication in terms of your experiences in Vietnam. Exactly. Time and scheduling norms. Some cultures are more laid back than other cultures. There are these expectations, these norms around what this time means. I'm in a laid back culture. This one was not an overseas culture, but I'm a native of New Orleans, and I'm probably going to touch on that at some point. But time is really not lax. I'm not going to say lax, laid back there. And many years ago, I went in as a consultant for the Economic Development Association following Katrina to help businesses restructure. And there was a decision made for the gentleman and I that had accompanied me. He was from the Midwest to give a presentation to people about some of the things that we found. And this gentleman had a flight leaving that day. So he was told by the organizer for the city of New Orleans that I should do the presentation and not him. And part of it was, and he was actually expert. I wasn't. He was the expert. So he didn't understand that because, well, I'm the actual economic development expert. She's a volunteer that's here to help, right? And it was explained to him two things. One, you have a flight to catch to return to your home, and the time structure here is more laid back. And the other one was in terms of where I think because of direct and indirect communication, he also explained to the gentleman because she's a native of the city, they're going to accept what you guys have to offer from her faster than they'll accept it from you, even though you're the bona fide expert. So fast forward, we show up for the 9 o'clock meeting. And 9:15 came and went. 9:30 came and went. 9:45 came and went. And this guy is about to just come out of his skin. And I'm sitting there going, they'll get here, they'll get here, they'll get here. And at about 10 minutes to 10, everybody came walking in with their coffee and they're laughing and they're talking and they're, getting seated around the table. And I was so tempted to say, what time was the 9 o'clock meeting? But I didn't. So just even things like that. And then ironically, the gentleman did have to get up and leave to go catch his flight, right? But that was the thing with the time and scheduling norms, is that was not normative to him at all. And honestly, because I had done a career in the military, while that may have been my home culture, that was not normative for me either anymore. So it's part of why I was tempted to say what time was the 9 o'clock meeting, but I behaved. No longer a cultural fit in my own home culture, which I'm sure if we had some time for that discussion, we could have some lively discussions about after we've gone from our home cultures for a while and we return home. Are you guys aware that for the Japanese, when kids who are in international movie families that are from Japan, when the kids return to Japan, they put them in the school to reacculturate them? Yeah, true. Parenting and discipline differences. I saw a joke on the internet the other day about an international marriage and the difference in how the mother from the husband's culture did disciplining, but they did it with humor and it was funny, but with so much truth to it. Is that navigating the differences in terms of parenting and how you discipline, and then in terms of emotional expression. We talked about that a little bit, Ludmila, in terms of jokes in Italy not necessarily translating in the same way in the US, but emotional expressions and silence. And that sometimes we take silence of people disagreeing with us or not wanting to interact and communicate with us. But sometimes the silence is just that's cultural. Anything there before we move to the next slide? Okay. The emotional layers of being and adjusting and adapting to the American culture and any other culture. So I kind of notice that I go back and forth because we can move from culture to culture to culture, and we're going to experience things in different ways each time we move. So the emotional layers that we experience when we're adapting and adjusting to the new environments that we come in very often show up as isolation, homesickness, grief. And very often people don't realize that they're going through grief because it's masked and it comes out as something else. But up underneath that it really is grief that's filling. Grief because I don't know the rules anymore. Grief because I don't feel like I belong or I don't feel like I fit. I feel isolated. I miss my home culture. I miss my family. And when we're navigating these experiences, which very often when we're going to new cultures and environments, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of trepidation, there's a lot of fear. And so when we have the courage to make these moves because of the chosen lifestyle, that represents a layer of strength for us. And at the same time, very often we feel invisible in a culture that's not our own. Whether it's in the workspace, whether it's at the BX, whether it's out in the community, we can feel invisible. And then cultural pride and confusion is often a layer that's in there for us. So, quote, being close to a church community helped me to adapt, meeting other spouses. Guys, this is my daughter-in-law. I told her, I said, I'll keep you anonymous, but this is my daughter-in-law. Meeting other spouses from Southeast Asia gave me emotional and spiritual support. So one of the things that she learned early in the game was to seek out organizations that catered to her cultural environment to help her transition and adapt and feel connected. And it becomes really important when we do those things. Next slide. Okay, We are almost out of time, so I'm going to skip through some of these. You are resilient. You cross cultural and emotional borders. Pat yourself on the back for that. And adapting doesn't have to mean that you lose yourself, that I can still be who I am and at the same time make the adjustments and adaptations to the environment that I'm in. And what it really means is as we make these cultural adaptations, when we make these adaptations in ourselves, I encourage you to do it in a way that you don't lose your full self. But it's also an opportunity for you to be able to expand and bring in more into your cultural, into your person. Next slide. Practical tools for that. Kind of what my daughter-in-law shared in her quote. Going to the family readiness centers, taking ESL classes, volunteering, joining local groups to help you adapt and adjust the community that you're in, especially with military people sometimes. It was my experience, and I hear it's still going on sometimes. They never leave the base. I highly encourage people to get out there, get into the local community, have the experiences. Been some of my best experiences when I decide to immerse myself in the culture that I find. Seek out cultural and faith-based communities and hubs that will help you in being able to fit in, learn, adapt, adjust, and develop your own resilience when you're in this lifestyle. Next slide. Okay. Identity evolution. I am in a new stage in my life. And so, as well as my working within this world that we're in right now that we're talking about, I'm at a new stage in my life in terms of my age. And one of the things that I'm learning and I'm beginning to work with other, especially women who are in this stage of life, is that it becomes really important for us to focus on identity evolution. But when I started sharing this with people that are in your lifestyle, they were going, oh my God, we need to do this too, right? I said, okay, I'll add this in. It becomes really important in terms of our evolution. Yes, I used to provide this kind of services for the military, so absolutely, I highly endorse it. I highly endorse it. Thank you for sharing that, Sonia. Appreciate it. So, in identity evolution, remember your own home culture, where you're from. You're going to always be from there. It's not erased. Please don't allow it to be erased. Cherish it, embrace it, hold on to it, celebrate it, okay? And then allow the experiences to expand you. You're not replacing your own cultural identity, but you are weaving it into something new and different. And it becomes really important that we also do that alongside our children, that we're both teaching them about the cultural norms of our home culture, as well as helping them to navigate and embrace that the culture they're in. And for those who are familiar with the Clear Culture Kids concept, it's that idea of the kids, it's not erasing either culture, but it is making adaptations into the culture in a way that reflects who they are. I had 4 children, 2 born overseas, 2 born in 2 different states. It amazed me because each one of them was a reflection of where they were at the time that they were coming along developmentally, because they were infusing parts of the culture that they were in into their own identity. So as close as they were also very different. And one of the mistakes I made early on as a military mom and moving around with my kids is I used to think my kids were little clones of me. Oh my goodness, how wrong was I? They were all developing and adapting depending upon what their circumstances and what their environment was. Were we a family? Yes. But did they have their nuanced differences as a result of that? Absolutely. You carry a culture forward even as you go into new spaces. So important. And belonging can stretch across borders, across languages, and generations. As I shared earlier, I am now a grandma to the military. Next slide. adapting to the American workplace when you don't know the rules. We kind of touched on them, but I'm just going to leave it up there for a minute so you guys can look at some of the bullets that I have there in terms of adapting. Because very often we go into a new workplace, we do not know. When our kids go into new school environments, they very often, if they're in the military schools, they have that structure of the military. So that's something they can count on. That's a constant for move to move to move. But if they end up in a community school, my kids told me the first time they went to community school, they felt like space cadets. They were so different than the kids in the rural schools that they were attending. And their peers thought they were weird. They're like, where's that song? They not like us? Their peers knew they were different. So every workplace has its own culture. So sit back, observe, take it in, communicate, interrupt if you need to get things. Don't be afraid to say, wait, I'm not quite sure I'm getting that. Ask questions and then give feedback about your own experiences of what's happening. What's light in one culture may feel abrupt or overly formal in another. And this is not just in the work. I'm married to a guy from the East Coast. I grew up in New Orleans where the culture may as well be two different countries. And the first time my husband met my mother, and New Orleans is a close, high touch. With that, so I think it was Sonia was sharing with me about the kissing on the cheek, that kind of culture. And so the first time my husband encountered my mother, she was so excited to meet her son-in-law. So she walked up and she put maybe this much space between him and her. Normative in my culture. Oh my God, he went, he moved. And she moved. Okay, I'm going to go like here. So she's here, he moved. She moved, he moved. By this time, if they had noticed me, I was smiling and laughing because I could see what was happening to the two of them. And she would touch him and he would react and he would, So at some point she stopped and she turned and she looked at me and she said, "What's wrong with your husband? Does he not like me or something? Is there a problem?" Like, "No, Mom, there's not a problem with you. You're entering into his personal space and that's not comfortable for him." And she just looked at him and said, "Oh, well, we don't do personal space here." Okay. Now, over the years, they adapted and adjusted. His adjustment was he didn't move as far back, and her adjustment was that she didn't move as close in. And they came to this happy medium that worked for them, right? And they made a good team. But it was that adapting and making those adjustments. And like my mother didn't know his rules, he didn't know her rules, and so they had to learn this about one another. So whether it's in our personal lives, yeah. My Italian mom is the same. Sometimes I think because there's a very large Italian American population in New Orleans, that influenced that part of the culture. I believe that for years. So find a cultural interpreter. I talked about that a little bit earlier. It has helped me every time I have moved, whether it's domestic or international, to have someone that can help me interpret what are the norms, what are the rules in the location that I'm in. Okay? It's okay to name your perspective, saying where I'm from, we usually can open a conversation instead of creating conflict. So don't be afraid to say, "Oh, it's just in my culture, we tell these really funny jokes that I'm learning may not be received the same here." Okay? And language differences. I used to be stationed in Turkey. I had this young man that worked for me that loved to tell jokes, but he would try to tell us the jokes in English. We would all be sitting there just kind of looking at him like we don't get it, right? But one day I looked at him and I said, "Could you please tell us?" We knew the joke because he was trying to tell, but we didn't get how funny it was. And so I said, "Could you just share the joke with us in Turkish?" So he told us, and he could not stop laughing as he was telling it in his own language, with his comfort zone in his own language, because we had the words in English, and now we're seeing his delivery of the joke. Everybody was having a great time laughing. So you can just adapt and adjust to be able to communicate, because what he was wanting to do was communicate, be in relationship with us. And that was one of the ways that he used to be in a relationship with us. And it became the joke around the office is when he wanted to tell a joke, he would first tell it in English, then he would tell it in Turkish, and we would get it. You're allowed to not know. It's okay to not know. Many Americans and any cultures, I think, will offer grace when they understand that you are navigating more than just the job, that you're navigating the culture, you're navigating the nuances. It's just, you don't have to know all the rules, but if you're willing to be vulnerable and open and ask for help, then not always, but most often, people will be genuine in trying to help. And in doubt, ask. Curiosity is often more welcome than thought. Next slide. This is kind of to go along with the becoming part of an American family. Family traditions, time together, emotional expression vary by culture. When I first met my East Coast husband's family, and they were very quiet and subdued, and it was such an adjustment for me. But I eventually realized that was just the way they do things. It didn't mean that they didn't have fun or they didn't love each other. Just that their expression was very different in terms of family interaction. And vice versa, they didn't know what to do with me when they first met me because I was so very all over the place. What we may feel is quiet or distant isn't necessarily rejection. Okay, when I met my husband's family, they were really quiet. I was wondering, just like my mother, about my husband, is there a problem with me? Do they not like me? And actually, the truth is they love me. Bring pieces of your culture into the family. Celebrate the richness of both cultures and both traditions. I make both traditions to pull one on myself. Want to say more about that one? I love it.
Sometimes when I go, so in India, it's like, we're very collectivist. So I'll tell my husband that you need to give my sister money when she, comes to like see you. So then like, we'll kind of like split the money. We make up like weird things to kind of just take advantage of him. And we'll tell him later, but it's always nice to make extra.
I love that's the other thing too, is that idea of when we're coming from different cultures, it becomes really important that we should be the family create some new traditions that come out of the fact that there are differences, and that we share those differences, and we bring them together. And especially for children, it's so important for them to learn about both cultures. Many years ago, when I was in the acting, an acting therapist, I worked with a couple where when they came in, one of the problems was that her husband was really, really wanting the children to learn and know about his culture. That was really important to him. And all I would hear, section after section, was why it was so important for him to learn about his culture. And I finally looked at her and I said, I haven't heard you say anything about your culture. Tell me about your culture. And her response to me was, I'm white, I don't have culture. And then I just smiled because I already knew where she was from originally. I said, well, I don't specifically know your culture, but I used to live in the Midwest. Let me share with you about what I know about the Midwest culture. And as I began to share things, she would go, oh, wait, well, we do this and we do that and we have that. And then she turned and she looked at her husband. She said, I do have culture. Right? And then from there, we were able to talk about how to navigate the two sets of norms in his family and her family in a way that was beneficial for the kids to embrace and know both family cultures, right? And they say that marriage. So it becomes really important that we embrace, respect, learn. We don't have to accept everything about the other family. We don't have to accept everything about the culture that we really don't. but find ways to help yourself fit in because your resilience will grow. Remember, you're not doing it wrong. You're actually reading something new and hopefully exciting. Next slide. Integration without relation, I think I've touched on that. So we can integrate without erasing our own cultural backgrounds when we're moving amongst and between to and from other cultures. Next slide. Closing reflection. What are you most proud of in your own journey? And what is one next step that you can take in your own experience, in your own journey of adapting and living both in the military culture and the American culture? Something to reflect about. Next slide. Okay. We're coming to the end of this, and then I'll open up a little bit for questions. I'm looking at the time. I can stay a little longer if you guys want me to stay, if you want some discussions. I very often like to say to my clients or ask my clients when we're coming to the end of a counseling or a coaching engagement, when you're in this is the last time we're going to be together, and you're standing at the elevator and you're saying to yourself, boy, am I glad I did this. What will you be saying to yourself that makes you know you're really glad that you did the coaching, did the counseling, showed up at this workshop? Just kind of keeping this thought throughout there. I learned it's okay to grieve what I left behind. Discovering that I'm not alone in my awkwardness. It's okay to not know the rules. I found language, feelings that I've been carrying silently, but now I can express myself in a way where I can feel heard and seen and understood. And I'm starting to feel my footing. In the years where I was actively working with military families and with families in global transition, working with Ruth families, and I named my company Land on Your Feet. And the whole reason for that was that idea is I really wanted to help people be able to land in wherever it was they found themselves in a way that they felt like they had to. So, next slide. And this is the one where I think it's for 2 minutes. All right. In the time that we have left, any questions, discussions, commentary, feedback?
Mila, are you going to turn off the recording?
Yes, actually right now